18 million. Just take a second and let that massive number sink in. 18 million Americans served in the armed forces during World War II. It's a staggering figure, right? It immediately establishes the sheer, unprecedented scale of the nation's mobilization.
And out of that massive group, a full 10 million were deployed overseas. We're talking about a logistical, societal, and military effort that completely reshaped the globe, and, really, the lives of everyday citizens. But hey, the mobilization wasn't just happening on the front lines. Back home, 25 million workers regularly gave up part of their paychecks to buy war bonds. This really anchors the incredible domestic effort required to sustain the whole shebang, from the factories to the battlefields. It honestly looked like the entire country was moving in absolute lockstep. Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to examine this era of seemingly perfect unity by looking through a very specific historical lens, unpacking it together like a giant puzzle. We're diving right into Chapter 16 of Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. And this chapter poses a pretty fascinating question: was World War II truly a people's war? So, how do we tackle this? In this explainer, we're taking a Socratic dialectical approach, which basically just means we're going to neutrally examine the traditional consensus, the standard history most of us learned in school, and weigh it directly against Zinn's historical critique. We aren't taking sides here. We're simply exploring the evidence exactly as Zinn presents it so we can better understand how history is actually constructed. Okay, here's our roadmap for the critique. First, the consensus of war. Second, shifting political perspectives. Third, was support manufactured? Fourth, defender or empire? And finally, the historical record. All right, Section 1, the consensus of war. We'll start with the traditional narrative we're all so familiar with. Zinn actually acknowledges right out of the gate that, looking at certain evidence, World War II was the most popular war the United States had ever fought. I mean, those sheer mobilization numbers we looked at just a moment ago, 18 million in uniform, 25 million buying bonds, they created an undeniable textbook image of universal national unity. Never had a greater proportion of the country participated in a conflict. It looked like a total unbroken consensus. Moving on to Section 2, shifting political perspectives. Now, when you look closely, that illusion of simple unity starts to reveal some pretty fascinating mechanics. For example, Zinn points out how rapidly political alignments shifted. Back in 1939, the American Communist Party literally put on a skit mocking the war's motives, calling it very emphatically an imperialist war. But fast forward just 2 years to 1941, after Germany invaded Soviet Russia, and their stance completely reversed. Suddenly, they're calling it a people's war against fascism. And this brilliantly illustrates Zinn's observation about the wartime environment. Despite massive political and class divides, practically all Americans ultimately found themselves in agreement. Yet capitalists and communists, Democrats and Republicans, the rich and the poor, all miraculously aligning. But Zinn asks us to hit pause for a second and really consider exactly how this unanimous agreement was achieved. Which brings us to Section 3. Was support manufactured? So this is the major pivot of Zinn's critique. He asks a really direct, provocative question. Could this actually be considered a manufactured support? Like, if everyone is agreeing, is it because of a natural grassroots groundswell, or is it because the entire infrastructure of society is just pushing them in a single direction? To answer that, Zinn points to the sheer institutional forces behind the calls for all-out war. Because it wasn't just the government, it was the press, the church, and even the chief radical organizations. All the power of the nation was pointed in one single direction. So Zinn asks us to critically consider, with all of these powerful entities uniformly demanding war, was there maybe an undercurrent of reluctance? Were there unpublicized signs of resistance that were simply suppressed by this overwhelming institutional power? Let's look at Section 4, Defender or Empire. Here, the text contrasts self-proclaimed motives with actual history, and the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote right from the text. Zinn writes, "For the United States to step forward as a defender of helpless countries matched its image in American high school history textbooks, but not its record in world affairs." This really hits the nail on the head for his argument. There's this stark disparity between the textbook imagery we're taught, the U.S. as the reluctant defender of the helpless, and the cold, hard historical reality of its actions on the world stage. And that leads into Section 5, the historical record. Zinn absolutely backs up his philosophical claim with hard historical evidence here. Just look at this extensive track record. The U.S. opposed the Haitian Revolution for Independence, it instigated a war with Mexico to take half its land, it intervened in Cuba to plant military bases, it seized Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam, it fought a brutal war to subjugate the Filipinos, it used gunboats to force Japan to open its trade, and it sent troops to assert Western supremacy in China. Phew! Zinn groups these deliberately, right? He's building this rapid, escalating picture of a long history of imperial action, which naturally raises the question, does a nation with this resume suddenly fight a purely selfless war?
Now, you might be wondering, why are we looking at all of this? Well, this explainer is ultimately an exercise in historiography, and historiography is just the study of how history is actually written. We're neutrally examining exactly why Zinn contrasts the stated noble aims of World War II with past imperial actions. He does this to remind us that history is almost always written from the standpoint of the conquerors and the leaders. So by looking at the actual historical record, Zinn invites us to look past that dense atmosphere of wartime fervor and evaluate a nation based on its actions rather than just its rhetoric.
And that brings us to a final, provocative thought to leave you with today. Zinn asks, would post-war America in its policies at home and overseas exemplify the values for which the war was supposed to have been fought? It's a brilliant question that asks us to critically reflect on the relationship between a nation's stated values and its actual real-world policies. Did the reality of the post-war world actually match the rhetoric of a people's war? It's something that absolutely deserves your thought, and I really hope this explainer has given you a brand new framework for exploring it. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me.